Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here today. I would like to thank the Kiel Institute and the Global Economy Prize jury for nominating me as this year's prize winner in Science and Economics category. And thank you all for coming here today. I really wish I could be in Kiel with you in person, but instead I'm sitting here in my dining room in Canberra, as due to COVID-19, the national and even most of the state borders in our country are closed here. And we are in the middle of 5 weeks of lockdown. So let me share my screen. So the title of my talk today is Sustainable Urban Systems, Interlinkages, Innovations, and Transition. I would like to talk about three things. First, I'll briefly touch upon urbanization and the impact of cities in the Anthropocene, and then explore how we can understand the interlinkages within and across cities as complex systems. Then I'll talk about the notion of urban sustainability experiments and transition, and how systems approach can actually help the science and practice of transition towards sustainability. We are living on an urban planet. More people are living in cities than in rural areas. And according to the UN projection, more than 2 billion people will be added to world cities by 2050. And roughly 2/3 of world population will be urban residents. 90% of all this new urban population will be added to cities and urban areas in developing countries, mostly in Africa and Asia. And here are the top 3 countries in terms of urban population growth. India, for example, will add 416 million new urban residents, China 255 million, and Nigeria 189 million. So different factors really drive this large-scale rapid urbanization, and people come to cities because they cannot make living in rural areas, or they're simply looking for better opportunities in cities. And sometimes government policy plays a key role. For example, we all know that China has experienced some of the most dramatic urbanization process over the last 40 years. And the urbanization ratio has grown from just under 18% in 1978 to over 60% in 2020. And such process is driven primarily, of course, by the aspiration of people for a better life in cities, while the national policy factors also played a major role. In 2014, China developed the National New Type Urbanization Plan, which aimed to bring up the urbanization ratio to 60% by 2020, which is a 1% increase per year. And this is a very, very fast pace. And it has been a very ambitious plan that covers almost every conceivable aspect of urbanization, aimed to actively promote urbanization and also guide and navigate the process towards a bit more sustainable end, with significant improvements in areas such as public service, infrastructure provision, and resource and environmental impacts. So due to this very strong national government role in this, in a paper published in 2014, we called this the greatest experiment in human settlement in history. And I always say that urbanization is really one of the biggest social transformations of our time. Many scholars believe that the impact of human activities has reached the point where it affects the classification of geological epoch. That is, we have broken away from Holocene, which has provided us with approximately 10,000 years of relatively stable climate and environment, which in turn supported almost the entire history of human civilization, and entered a new epoch, the Anthropocene. So what are the characteristics of urbanization in the Anthropocene? We summarized 3 characteristics in a paper published early this year, led by Professor Thomas Elmquist at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And those 3 characteristics are changing diversity, changing modularity, and changing complexity. So the changing diversity here refers to our cities becoming increasingly diverse if you look at inside of a single city. For example, the type of food we consume and their origin are becoming increasingly diverse, and the information and technologies we are exposed to are also becoming more and more diverse. But as a whole, there is an increasing conversion across different cities. And in terms of modularity, in the past, cities and their neighboring areas tends to form a relatively independent module that can largely perform their function independently. However, with the increasing number of cities and the increasing level of globalization, these connections between cities have become more and more complex and close, and the independence between the modules is lost. And in many cases, even the modules themselves no longer exist. And in terms of complexity, the distance between production and consumption, as well as between behavior and consequence of the behavior, is becoming more and more distant, separated by more and more intermediate steps. And in this process, a large amount of information is actually lost in this transmission. So what does the global urbanization mean for the planet? I'll raise just one example here. In December 2020, there was a study published in Nature, which grabbed worldwide media attention. It shows that in 2020, the global human-made mass exceeded the mass of all living biomass. So the total biomass in dry mass basis is just below 1.2 teraton, and the anthropogenic mass, including concrete, aggregate, bricks, asphalts, metals, and other things such as plastic, has reached the same level last year. And the paper shows we have doubled the anthropogenic mass roughly every 20 years over the recent decades. And this is another figure from the same paper, contrasting some key components of global biomass and anthropogenic mass in the year 2020. The total mass of all animals on the planet is roughly 4 gigaton here, whereas the plastic is 8 gigaton, which is double of the previous number. And the total mass of trees and shrubs are estimated at 900 gigaton, whereas buildings and infrastructure is estimated at 1,100 gigaton. So what does this mean for urbanization of cities? To me, this instantly shows that cities are the culprit here, as they have the highest concentration of buildings and infrastructure. This is only looking at the stocks, but these stocks do not really become stocks by themselves. And the process of building these stocks entails enormous amount of energy and associated environmental impacts. For example, we know that cities already emit 75% of all CO2 from final energy use. And our analysis a couple of years ago shows that building and upgrading this urban infrastructure in developing cities will release up to 226 gigaton CO2 by 2050. And this is shown in the figure on the right. Building infrastructure to upgrade developing cities would produce about 109 gigaton of CO2, bringing this infrastructure level to the same level as developed country cities. And the infrastructure, building the infrastructure required for 2 billion more people will generate another 117 gigaton of CO2. So together there will be roughly more than 4 times of CO2 emission used to build existing developed world infrastructure. And you can compare this to the concept of carbon budget, which is considered to be about 800 gigaton remaining if we are to keep the global warming within 2 degrees Celsius. And also this is a huge number even compared to the entire anthropogenic stock, which is about a bit more than 1/5. But then carbon emission is just one example of environmental impacts of cities. In a review looking at the conceptual and empirical advances on linkages between urbanization and the environment over the past 10 years or so, we summarized some emerging trends and remaining questions on this topic. We have seen there is an increasing evidence on the amplified or accelerated environmental impacts of urbanization. And there's a varying distribution patterns of impacts along geographical and other socioeconomic gradients. There's a shifting focus from understanding and quantifying the impacts of urbanization towards understanding the processes and underlying mechanisms that are causing this kind of impacts. And there's a great increasing focus on understanding complex interactions and interlinkages among different environmental, social, economic, and cultural processes. And there has been several conceptual advances in recent years that really calls for articulating and actually using a systems approach when we study and practice in cities. And in terms of governing the urban environment, there is an increasing focus on on the importance of public participation and co-production of knowledge with stakeholders. And cities are actively experimenting towards sustainability under a plethora of guiding concepts that really manifests the city's aspirational goals. And this sort of practice had varying levels of implementation and effectiveness. So if we are to really effectively navigate urbanization and manage their impacts, we really need to look at what's happening inside the cities very closely. It is important to have appropriate conceptual understanding of cities. And as I have just mentioned, over the last 2 decades also, there is a growing consensus in the urban research community that we really need to consider cities as human-dominant complex systems. And there are many elements encompassed in this understanding. A systems approach requires imagining cities in their multifarious manifestations, for example, as geophysical space, as physical infrastructure, as economic relationships, as social entities, and also as cultural practices. For example, we know that cities are open systems continually exchanging resources, products, and services with our outside world. And cities are complex, self-organizing, adaptive, and constantly changing, evolving entities. And cities also encompass multiple actors with varying responsibilities, capabilities, and priorities, as well as processes that transcend the institutional compartmentalization of city or other administrations. And cities are really embedded in a broader ecological, economic, technical, institutional, legal, and governance structures that often constrain their systematic functions, which really cannot be separated from the broader power relations that the cities are situated in. And urban processes are causally interlinked with interactions and feedbacks that result in both intended and unintended consequences. And this is our attempt to visualize these views. In this figure, urban system structure and interlinkages are shown, with the left component focusing more on the internal structure and the right one highlighting external linkages and interactions of cities. So the symbols represent here actors, constituents, structure, and processes across the physical, built, or social or economic and ecological subsystems of an urban system. And the arrows here represent complex processes and linkages within and between cities and their hinterlands. And the actors and constituents are typically self-organizing, and the structure, process, and linkages and functions are dynamic and evolving with nonlinear pathways forward. So one of my main research focus has really been understanding this urban system structure, function, process, and interlinkages, and explore their determinants and influencing factors. So hereafter, I would like to highlight some of our works exploring these urban system elements mentioned above. I think many of us have really seen the horrific images of flooding in subways in China's Zhengzhou city, for example, and the destroyed bridges and buildings as unprecedented flood really swept through part of Germany and Belgium this year. And right now, as we're speaking, New York is suffering from a big flood damage. And in the case of Zhengzhou, for example, more than a year worth of rain, which is about 670 mil versus 600 mil per year in a normal year, came down on a single day, which is said to be once in a 1,000-year chance, that is, less than 0.1% of chance of occurring. And in this case, the typhoon near the South China and then the typology of the region is considered to be the major reasons of this unusual amount of rainfall. But does urbanization actually play a role in this process? Our study published in 2017 shows that urbanization and urban activities can actually increase the heavy rainfall and therefore increasing the flood incidence and associated hazards in cities. Our statistical analysis of over, I think, 700 observational stations in China across 660 years show there's a very strong spatial-temporal correlation and causality between urbanization indicators and heavy rainfalls in the city. And these anthropogenic factors are actually major contributors in the increased heavy rainfall in China. So based on this, we're really calling for a better understanding of anthropogenic influences into these large-scale climate processes and the need for a better integration of these influences into the global climate models. And this is just one example of the many complex interactions among different processes in urban systems. So one of the key concepts to understand the urban system is urban metabolism. This figure is a conceptualized representation of urban metabolism. We know that food, water, materials, and products, energy, capital, information, and people all enter into cities. And part of these resources flow into cities and they become urban stock. Others enable and drive various anthropogenic functions of the city and eventually produce intended or unintended outputs that either stay within the system boundary or exported beyond the boundary with various impacts on the physical environments, the flora and the fauna, and the associated ecological processes in urban areas. And we know that this kind of urban metabolism is shaped and regulated by factors such as urban policy and governance, culture, and individual behaviors in the city. There were a large amount of empirical works under the umbrella of urban metabolism, especially over the last decades or so. These empirical insights can have significant contribution towards understanding cities as complex human-dominant ecosystems. For example, the empirical works really show that the anthropogenic flows exceed those mobilized by natural process at a large extent. And there's very strong linear flows showing there's a strong external dependencies cities have. And there's the increasing magnitude of flows despite increasing efficiency in most part of the world, most part of the urban areas in the world. And there's much larger intra-city heterogeneity in developing cities than developed cities. And the functional role of city development stage, the technology or the level of infrastructure, income and other socioeconomic characteristics, and even individual choices and behavior, they all influence these flows. We also know some of these flows, for example, like SOx concentration, SOx concentration in cities, they actually follow environmental Kuznets curve, meaning initially they increase, worsen, but as the city grow and then the economy develops in the city, they tend to improve. And we also know that urban policy and governance practice can play a significant role in shaping and regulating the metabolism. I would like to use food as a thread to actually illustrate the various interlinkages of urban systems and actually how systems approach can open up alternative solutions to seemingly deadlock kind of problems. So in rapidly urbanizing world, the expansion of urban land use is often achieved via converting the natural and agricultural land into urban built-up area. And such process, which we call as landscape urbanization, is very often driven by socioeconomic processes. In this paper, we showed there is a positive feedback between the landscape urbanization and economic growth in China, which means the urban land expansion is not only the consequence of economic growth in cities, but also drivers of such growth. And this is quite alarming for a country like China, for example, which has the biggest world population and where per capita arable land is only 1/3 of the world average. And because of such positive feedback means it will be very difficult for the country to simultaneously achieve two of its important policy goals, namely minimize arable land loss for food security and also promote urbanization for economic growth. It appears to be a deadlock since urban expansion reduces the availability of croplands. Urbanization is very often considered as a threat to food security in that country. However, if we adopt a systems thinking and connect several different processes together, it could be a totally different picture. In a work published earlier this year in Nature Food in March 2020 actually. And the papers are in collaboration with colleagues in Zhejiang University. We conducted a spatial statistics and scenario analysis to really quantify the impact of urbanization on agriculture. We found here that actually an increase in China's urbanization level from 56% in 2015 to about even 80% in 2050 would actually release 5.8 million hectares of rural land for agricultural production, which is equivalent to about 4% of China's total cropland area in 2050. So even considering the relatively low land fertility of this new cropland, the 2050 crop production would still increase by 3 to 4% compared to 2015. And it turned out that there are a large amount of untapped into croplands that has been wasted so far. The expansion of rural built-up area, despite the rural population, has been decreasing. In fact, while the rural population has been decreasing, the rural built-up area has been increasing at a much larger magnitude than actually the urban built-up area expansion. The lack of security and sense of belonging of these incoming workers in cities make them very reluctant to give up their rural house or rural land quota, which is very often left uncultivated because they left the village. They invest their savings to build much bigger house back in their village, often on agricultural land just next to their old discarded house. If this kind of land can effectively be reclaimed and utilized, then cropland can actually increase as urbanization level increases. Of course, to achieve such a goal, it is essential that we adopt an integrated urban-rural development with reclamation of rural built-up lands that is left behind, but also combining it with the socio-economic policy that actually accepts the incoming population into the urban fabric. So this finding provides a very novel insight into the urbanization and food security debate. And land is not only solution for food security. In another work with the same group of collaborators, which was published in Nature in 2019, I think, We found that a 40% increase in agricultural land is projected to be needed by 2030 in order to feed the increasingly affluent urban population in China. But if we combine the supply side and demand side management, such as cutting food waste, reducing meat consumption, enhancing crop yield, and boost animal nutrient use, and a myriad combination of these different measures, then there can be multiple pathways actually to curb the demand on increased land. And managing food consumption-related environmental impact is another big challenge. We know cities are open systems and almost entirely relying on import of food from external areas. And this is a figure from our recent study tracking food-related environmental footprint, for example, water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus in major urban regions in China. Understanding where such impacts originate geographically, as well as in the supply chain, can better inform cities and regions in developing mitigation strategies. For example, the Jing-Jin-Ji metropolitan regions area, which is on top of this figure here, and the area actually includes Beijing, the capital of the country. More than 2/3 of the footprints actually arise from agriculture and food processing, and more than 80% are actually from other regions within China, and while approximately 8% are from the rest of the world. And help enhancing environmental efficiency in key supply regions or sectors can actually be a very effective strategy to reduce the environmental footprint of the metropolitan area. And in another study, we found that what kind of policy measures our cities adopt can actually directly affect the safety of food we consume. In this recent work, we looked at the level of pesticide residues in marketed fruits and vegetables in cities, in Chinese cities. And we found that local socioeconomic and policy factors roughly explain about 40% of the intercity disparities of the level of pesticide residue, and that local policy had a very strong impact on local food safety, and then actually even more than the socioeconomic factors. And a systems approach is needed if we are trying to reduce the pesticide residue with a combination of production regulations, setting standards for inflowing food, and enhancing the consumer awareness. These are all called for in order to achieve higher food safety in cities. And of course, COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for many cities. It has really exposed the vulnerability of our modern urban systems and urban ways of life. As cities are projected to face increasing frequency and magnitude of natural disasters such as climate change, understanding what makes cities and urban systems more resilient is really crucial. So while the COVID-19 is still running its course, there are already some lessons that are emerging. And in this comment article published in Nature last year, we tried to distill some of these lessons. For example, I think our understanding of how cities work really needs to be improved. For example, it looks like there have been too many myths around the life in cities. The high density urban living is very often wrongly blamed for high death rates in urban disasters. Take, for example, New York City and Hong Kong. These cities have very similar population, both about 7 to 8 million, and some of the largest residential densities in the world. But density alone can really not explain such a drastic difference in the confirmed cases as well as the number of fatality. And we found no correlation between confirmed cases and population density, while we found a significant correlation between the timely action and confirmed COVID-19 cases. So this really means how cities are managed are far more important determinants than the physical characteristics, which suggests that probably the physical deterministic views towards our urban areas or urban outcomes really need to be discarded or at least seriously reconsidered. And in the Anthropocene, cities are just like people like us. They are hyperconnected, and such hyperconnectivity is very often considered a major source of vulnerability. After all, we have really witnessed how this COVID-19 rapidly spread across world cities through this kind of aeroplane sort of connections across world cities. But such networks can also be source of strength, or we would say they must be a source of strength. We argued in this same paper that one action, above all, strengthening and extending the networks within and between cities will make urban regions more resilient, regions more resilient to future pandemic and other crises such as climate change. And this figure shows the flow of aid materials through sister cities schemes between the Chinese cities and overseas cities during the pandemic. In this figure, the blue lines show flows to Chinese cities, orange lines show from Chinese cities, and the red lines show two-way flows between sister cities. So cities in China has received a lot of protective gears and medical equipments at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic from their sister cities globally. And as the virus spread, they later sent out much more aid than they initially received. So in reality, there are much more interactions, intercity flows. But what is shown here is only those flows through the sister city mechanism. So I would like to spend the remaining couple of minutes really explore the role of cities in leading sustainability transition. We know cities are really hotbeds for innovation and experimentation in technological, cultural, and in management and governance practices. We need to really have in-depth understanding of these initiatives. Such innovative initiatives can be considered as urban sustainability experiments. We define these sustainability experiments as planned initiatives that embody a highly novel socio-technical configurations, which is likely to lead to substantial sustainability gain. And there are many of these innovative practices or experiments in urban context. They are collected and documented, but very seldom systematically understood. But we think it is really important to really have a systematic understanding of how these experiments happen. Is there any commonalities across different cases? Can this learning shared and contextualized in different places? And how these individual experiments can be upscaled and play a bigger role in changing the systems towards more sustainable end? So here I would like to highlight several examples from our recent work to answer some of these questions. So we have conducted some in-depth analysis looking at Shanghai's low-carbon transition. Shanghai is designated as one of the low-carbon demonstration cities in China, and the city has initiated many low-carbon related policies and initiatives, including some 179 policies over the last 2 decades. What we found is the presence of an effective nested structure of innovation in Shanghai, where many policy-related projects are incubated and tested, and the learning of these practices will be used for city-level policymaking. And the lessons from Shanghai, as well as from other demonstration cities, will be extracted and be used to inform the national level low-carbon urban development policymaking. We know that individual successful experiments need to be either multiplied by others or change the upper level system if they are to really have a broader impact. And we know that the vertical linkages, such as among different levels of governments, is important in upscaling to change system. And there are, however, much less understanding on how experiments and innovations actually work across different contexts. And this is an important research area we consider. So here we looked at the contextualization process of energy performance contract practice, which was invented and adopted in USA and Europe, and then try to see how it is contextualized in Shanghai. And we conceptualized the formation of innovative socio-technical configurations in experiments and compared it to those happened in contextualization process. And we found that the contextualization process very often require a distinctive and new kind of alignment and reconfiguration of actors, resources, and therefore contextualization is much, much more than a simple copy. And indeed, it's very similar to a new innovation. Hence, we call this contextualization as a new innovation. And somehow some cities can be highly successful in terms of building the momentum to become and continue to be a frontrunner city in sustainability quest. And Kitakyushu City in Japan is one of such example. And through some in-depth study looking at the nature and the making of this Kitakyushu City as a frontrunner city, we found that this frontrunner city, Kitakyushu, can actually produce environmental and economic benefits and opportunities, both within themselves and beyond their boundaries, through urban experimentation that contributes to sustainability transition. And there's positive changes towards sustainability are created and sustained by a succession of self-reinforcing feedback loops involving citizens, businesses, local and national governments. And there is a positive inertia, which we coined in this study, which can be used to describe an emergent property of a city as a system, where the positive approaches are embedded into the city identity, and therefore it would not be influenced by short-term political cycle. And this figure is an example of the self-reinforcing feedback loops involving various different stakeholders, and how positive inertia can actually build through this sort of process. And we can see there is a succession of lead actors and reinforcing loops. And after the initial balancing loop with the pollution issues resolved. And we see that citizens' awareness, local government leadership, business and national government, they all play a very important role. And success becomes the platform and a stepping stone for the next experiments and success, generating a positive inertia and establishing the identity of a frontrunner city. So finally, before I conclude, I really would like to draw attention to the importance of building urban science in the global south. We know that urbanization is a global phenomenon, but there's a very distinctive difference between in the nature of urban challenges between urban north and urban south. And cities in the global south experience much, much more complex challenges, and very often all at the same time. And in addition, the global south often has much weaker knowledge basis to guide practice, and partly exacerbated by the bias in our knowledge production system, which prefers the study in and by global north. But cities in the global south also harbors very unique opportunities of innovations. And we really need, I think, a renewed emphasis on the research in the global urban south. And I often say that the battle for sustainability is really be won or lost in cities in the global south. So I really like to conclude this talk by really saying that understanding urban systems and the system of cities is really crucial to inform the science policy and practice towards building sustainable, resilient, healthy futures in the Anthropocene. Thank you.